If this keeps up, what's going to happen?
Oh, they'll get worse and worse. There is a situation today.
So what's causing it?
The fact that you do have those little elites who have their agenda.
Is there a way for you to put it in a nutshell about what people of, say, your own race say about you that they don't like what you say about
wait. I think one of the ways that the organized noisemakers have succeeded is saying that what they're saying is what their race is saying. My race is not saying that about me. Those particular individuals who are a small minority themselves within the black community, who have a vested interest in many of these programs, they are saying that. But when I checked out of my hotel this morning, you know, the black security guard came over and says, are you Sowell? And I said, yes, and he shook my hand warmly, and he walked me the length of the corridor and talked about this and about that. And that's not at all an uncommon experience for me. So it's not Sowell versus blacks, it's the black intellectuals. And the black intellectuals are no more typical of the black population than white intellectuals are of the white population. But they have a very large vested interest in certain beliefs which underlie various programs from which they benefit enormously. And as I point out in the book, this is common around the world, that the elites benefit from preferential programs, even when those programs are in the name of the masses. The masses do not benefit. In the case of the current so-called Civil Rights Act, the masses are going to lose big if that law goes into effect.
Why?
Because the racial tension is enormous on many campuses. The colleges themselves try to say that they're victims of the racism of the larger society. And in point of fact, the racism on the campuses is greater than that in the larger society, in many campuses. And what I worry about is that they're going to graduate into the general society, blacks and whites alike, who hate each other's guts, and who can be the leaders of new racial strife for the future.
What's causing that on college campuses?
One of the factors is the preferential policies. But it's more than just that, because that in itself sets in motion a series of events which add to the original resentment over the preferential policies. That is, you put yourself in the position of a black kid who comes out of a ghetto school, and he's gone through for 12 years with nothing but A's and B's, without a great deal of effort. And now he finds himself for the first time in his life in a predominantly white environment. And he finds that when he works twice as hard as he's ever worked, all he gets back for his work is a D. And that there is also a minority establishment. This is true not only of blacks but of minorities in general. Establishment which tells him, yes, this is the racism on this campus. That the white power structure is trying to keep you down, and it has to have a certain plausibility to it. And then there's someone there to tell them that this is all due to the white power structure. And then there are the white students who are sick of hearing that. And they say, if you can't hack it, that's your problem. Don't give us this junk. And then that's called insensitivity. It's self-reinforcing. You know, there are some reactions that are self-equilibrating, but there's some that keep feeding each other. Let's say an ugly racial incident happens on campus at one of the elite colleges. Invariably, the first thing that will be said is we must have now a larger quota of minority students, a larger quota of minority faculty, and we must now subject the white students to these sensitivity courses or ethnic courses or what have you, courses that they've rejected taking, otherwise they wouldn't be necessary to force them. That is not going to make things better, that's going to make them worse. But as they get worse, then you keep doing that, and so it's just an upward spiral, and I just don't know where that spiral is going to end. I don't see anybody with the courage to end it, and I see it leading only to bad things. Well, the act before Congress is going to make it possible to convict a company on that basis. Even before the Ward's Cove decision, I had heard from people who are knowledgeable about civil rights that attorneys were advising their employer clients, if you can't find black engineers or black accountants, then at least don't hire so many black janitors or assembly line workers, because it looks bad. And if they succeed, that means that it will hurt the people who most need a job, and it will benefit, if anyone, only a handful of people in elite positions. So that you can understand how the student would find this plausible. I talked to a black man recently, a lawyer, who said when he was in law school, he was told when he first got there that Professor X never gives black students more than a C. You know, and he got a B+. But there was great consternation because one of the myths had fallen. But it's truly criminal what goes on in terms of using and manipulating the students.
To any fundamental re-examination of the assumptions behind preferential policies That's the name of the book. And still more so, any resulting change of policies can expect to encounter their vocal, bitter, and determined opposition, including inevitable charges of racism against outsiders, labels of traitor put on any members of their own group who disagree with them, who disagree publicly with them, and whatever other claims or charges seem likely to be politically effective. When you said labels of traitor put on any members of their own group who disagree publicly with them, were you talking about yourself?
Only as one among many. Randall Kennedy up at Harvard did a very fine article in the Harvard Law Review last June, for which he was denounced as an academic minstrel and other things because he was out of step. I mean, people who raise their heads will set off a search and destroy mission because people have a lot at stake and they're sitting on a house of cards. They have many assumptions which simply cannot be examined carefully because those assumptions will collapse and they'll fall from a very high position to a very low position. And they are not about to tolerate people questioning what they're saying. I know a black woman, for example, who she has a PhD. She's had a book published. She's has a contract on another book. She's taught at a couple of very nice places. She has a devil of a time getting a job, not a job in a prestigious institution, a job teaching at a college. Shot down, blackballed, whatever, by people who don't like her ideology. That's happening not only racially, it's also happening even to where race is not an issue. Law school, I learned recently, there was a woman who was being considered for a 10-year position, and all the men voted for her and all the women voted against her because she does not follow radical feminism. And so you're getting these ideological tests so that at the very time that there's all this mouthing of the word diversity, there is this extremely narrow ideological conformity that's being enforced wherever people have the power to enforce it.
What are your politics outside of the race issue? How would you describe your...
Well, I always say that my political bias is that I'm biased against politics. And I haven't been a registered member of any political party since 1972. Really am quite disenchanted with politics of all sorts.
Why?
Well, I guess mainly just by following what they do and how they do it. That they're really quite clever at things they do, but the things they do really don't benefit the public very much. And that's not just race issues, all issues in general.
What's it that...
Publish it.
And then what do you hope will happen as a result of all this work?
I hope that people will start to re-examine some of the dogmas about race that have been unthinkingly repeated for a very long time by people who compliment themselves for being thinking people. I'll give you an example. The Japanese in the United States during World War II, as you know, were interned. They were treated very badly prior to that time. In Brazil, the Japanese were treated much better, and very few of them were interned. In the United States, the Japanese remained steadfastly loyal despite the bad treatment. In Brazil, the Japanese were loyal to Japan right on through to past the end of the war, despite the good treatment. You cannot explain this by what happened in the United States or in Brazil. You can only explain it if you understand that those two groups of Japanese were different before they ever got on the boat in Japan, and that difference persisted in the countries they went to.
How do the intellectual elite, both white and black, get to the position that they do in this country that you disagree with?
I mean, how do they have the influence they have?
Well, no, but what's their, from what your discussions over the years, what's their thought process that gets them there? Is it emotion or is it fact?
Emotion largely, but also a large amount of self-interest, increasingly self-interest. I think that if you went back, into the 60s, you'd find people with different views like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. But I think that both those men believed in what they said. Whereas today, you have people who are simply professional hustlers. And again, this is not peculiar to blacks or peculiar to the United States or even peculiar to racial issues. That organizations typically, many movements are set off by idealistic people who want to promote some good for mankind or for some group. But as time goes by and as they succeed, they'll be followed by people who can use these things for their own self-interest. And that's been the history of regulatory agencies in the government. It's been the history of, I think, of religions, that the first Christians who were being persecuted by the Roman Empire were not in it, for what they could get, because all they were going to get is trouble. But once Christianity became the state religion, this became a very lucrative career for some people. And then you get an entirely different kind of person coming in at that point, and we can have an entirely different kind of movement.
Let me,
And then I began to read some of the stuff they were writing, and I realized what nonsense it was. And I said, if this is what the professionals are doing, then we should try an amateur to do this. And once I got into it, I realized there were so many terrible things that the general public is simply unaware of. And there are so many bills of goods being sold to the public by people who personally gain from this stuff. I mean, when you sell a program, you become the program director, you become the consultant, you become all of that sort of thing. And I just needed to debunk some of that. And I think that's the reason I've written them. Then once I start to write them, I write them as I would approach any other subject intellectually.
does it make you mad when you see somebody, say, of a hard right-wing persuasion using you to further their own particular prejudices?
Well, there are so few opportunities for my ideas to get into print that I don't have the luxury of doing that. But it would bother me. I haven't seen much of that, actually. I haven't seen much of that.
Have you seen this over the last 10 years of our call-in shows? I'll bet you we've had 25 people call up and say, why don't you get Thomas Sowell on to talk about this issue? I've seen you once on television in my life on Meet the Press a couple years ago. This is the first time we've met, and it just leads me to the question of why have we not seen more of you? Have you avoided television? And if you have, for what reason?
Well, I guess it's a question of where your advantages lie. My advantages lie in writing the books. And in order to do the amount of work that I do, there are many other things I don't do. And unfortunately, there are very few people who take positions similar to mine. And if that viewpoint is to be heard at all, I'm going to have to be the one that does a lot of it. And therefore, I can't do a lot of other things. As regards television, there are many problems with television. Not the least of which are those shows where they tape you for an hour and a half and put you on for 5 minutes with other people interspliced to say what they have to say. And I don't go for that format at all, because it will end up proving whatever the people wanted to prove at the beginning.
Have you consciously avoided television for that reason?
Those kinds of television shows, yes.
Do you find that the media would ignore what you have to say because of the views you take? Have you ever sensed that?
Oh, sometimes, although it's not so much being ignored as being distorted beyond recognition. A terrible thing happened some years ago on CBS Morning News when they try to represent me as someone who believes that blacks are genetically inferior. And I had written, at least half a dozen articles attacking the thesis of Arthur Jensen. And so much so that the BBC had once wanted to arrange a debate between me and Jensen, and neither of us wanted to be bothered. But I was thinking, why is it that in London they understand what my position is, but in Washington they can't find out what it is? Particularly since it's been in print repeatedly and at enormous length. I conducted a large survey of IQs about 20 years ago, collected about over 100,000, and wrote all this stuff up. So it's a matter of public record. And yet to lie like that is just too much.
What's your favorite book out of the 14?
Oh, A Conflict of Visions.
Why?
I think it's what is more mine than anything else, in the sense that it doesn't build upon any theory that anyone else has, or anything that's already out there in the literature. And it's an attempt to explain why people reach different ideological positions from one another. How two people similarly informed, similarly well-meaning, will reach opposite conclusions, not just on a given issue, but on the whole range of issues. That if you were to take a resolution about military spending and take it to a pro-choice meeting and to a pro-life meeting, you would probably get a very different reading on it. Or if you took all sorts of other things wholly unrelated to the abortion question to those same two meetings, you would probably get entirely different readings on those other unrelated questions, because their positions grow out of a certain vision of the world. And if you have that vision of the world, then certain things make perfect sense, and certain other things make no sense at all.
You put or try to pop the balloon of a lot of what you call myths in this book about preferential treatment and whether or not it works. Is there any case, what you've studied, where going out and actively pursuing and preferring one group over the other that's helped that group?
Oh, I suppose Sri Lanka, perhaps. The question is, how much did it help them, and in what ways? In Sri Lanka, the Tamils are the minority, and the Sinhalese are the majority. And the preferences in that country are for the majority of the Sinhalese, because the Tamils had done quite well. And after a number of years, the Sinhalese were able to overtake the Tamils in income. But along the way, they had such violence in the street that people were burning each other alive in the street. The army, which is predominantly Sinhalese, when attacked in Tamil territory, has been known simply to stop a bus and take people off the bus and shoot a few of them at random because they're Tamils. And so if you say that's been a success, then it's been a...
Are there differences with people and races, differences in talent, and intelligence, and all those things? Since you've been studying, have you noticed differences around the world?
Well, there are differences in skills, if that's what you mean. That is, Germans have been prominent in piano manufacturing around the world, in Tsarist Russia or Australia or the United States and so on. Underlying differences, those I've argued against, the genetic differences, and those I've argued against, but that's another whole issue that I really don't get into in the book.
Why do then the different parts of the society do better than others?
I would look at it differently. I would say, and especially in the United States, I would say, why would we expect the different groups to do the same? I say especially the United States because there are very few indigenous Americans. Americans that come here from all over the world. And why would you ever expect that countries that had entirely different histories, located in entirely different climates, different geography, why would you expect those countries to develop exactly the same mix of skills to exactly the same degree so that their people would arrive on these shores in such a way that they would be represented evenly across the board? Especially since even in countries where most of the population is indigenous, you don't find it there. The Germans arrived here with piano-making skills, and therefore you shouldn't expect to find the Irish equally represented with Germans in the piano industry. So when you find Steinways and other German named pianos, you shouldn't expect to find O'Houlihan pianos to the same extent, and so on. Nowhere in the world do you find this evenness that people use as a norm. And I find it fascinating that they will hold up as a norm something that has never been seen on this planet and regard as an anomaly something that is seen in country after country, to serve all kinds of external purposes.
Kind of external purposes you're talking about?
Oh, political purposes. I just a couple of days ago was told by someone from Wellesley that there's a divestment campaign at Wellesley, demonstrations, the whole thing. That those black girls who did not want to participate in that were threatened with violence. And that's not unique. At Stanford, the Hispanic students, some Hispanic students, have complained that the Hispanic establishment has threatened them if they don't want to go along with what's being said and done. And they claim that only 15% of the Hispanic students at Stanford have ever attended a single event sponsored by the Hispanic establishment which speaks boldly in their name. And so you have, he's taking, if I understand it correctly, he's taking unpaid leave until such time as they hire a woman of color, as he says. But he's also said that by black, he does not mean skin color. He means those who are really black, not those who think white and look black. And so what he's really saying is he wants ideological conformity in the people that are hired to fill this position. That's not uncommon either. People have to recognize that all people owe their lives to the surrounding society, and that they cannot simply demolish it because it is unjust, because everything human has always been unjust. And that what you're going to do to make it better will have to be within that context. So that my tendency is to want more freedom for the individual and less. I don't want people making decisions who don't pay the price of their decisions. And that's what politics is all about. You don't pay the price of the decision. As I point out early in the book, one of the reasons we had a Jim Crow era in this country was because the politicians didn't pay the price of that. That was enormously costly to the white as well as to the black population. But the politicians who put that in didn't pay any cost for that. They drew their full salary irrespective of all that.